Confidence is often misunderstood as loudness, as certainty spoken quickly, or strength performed in public. But the deepest confidence is quieter than that. It lives in the person who does not rush to explain, who does not seek approval, who remains steady even when misunderstood. Machiavelli understood something subtle about human nature. People fear what they cannot shake. They respect what is not begged to be seen. This is not confidence as arrogance. It is confidence as inner control, a calm psychological power built slowly through awareness, restraint, and self-possession. This story explores that secret. Confidence does not always arrive as a feeling of certainty. Often it begins as a pause, a moment when a mind stops rushing to prove itself, when the body no longer reacts immediately to every gaze, every comment, every imagined judgment. For many people, confidence is something they believe must be visible. It must be loud. It must be declared. It must be shown through dominance or endless self-expression. But true confidence begins differently. It begins quietly. It appears in the person who does not over-explain, in the one who listens without needing to interrupt, in the one who is not emotionally pulled by every provocation. Machiavelli understood that power is often mistaken for noise. Yet the most influential presence is rarely the most aggressive, is the most composed. This is the first recognition. Confidence is not performance, it is self-possession. Psychologically, this recognition is important because the human nervous system is deeply social. People are trained to measure worth through reaction, through approval, through feedback. So insecurity often feels like urgency. The need to speak quickly, defend quickly, prove quickly. Confidence interrupts that urgency. It is not arrogance. It is calm. The quiet recognition is realizing that strength is not always in what is said. Sometimes it is in what is not needed. When a person no longer feels compelled to explain themselves to everyone, something shifts. They begin to carry stability inside rather than searching for it outside. This chapter is the beginning of that shift, not the arrival of perfection, but the awareness that confidence is not given by others. It is built internally through restraint, through presence, through clarity. And once that recognition settles, the mind starts to move differently, less desperate, less reactive, more grounded. Confidence begins as silence. Insecurity rarely begins in adulthood. It begins much earlier, in quiet moments the mind remembers without words. A child learns who they are through response. A smile becomes reassurance. Attention becomes safety. Silence becomes something to fear. Over time, the nervous system starts to associate worth with being noticed. If approval is given, the self feels stable. If it is withheld, the self feels uncertain. This is how insecurity forms, not as weakness, but as conditioning. Human beings are relational. They're shaped by mirrors, by teachers, parents, peers, strangers. So confidence becomes tied to reflection. How others respond, how others evaluate, how others validate. Machiavelli understood that people are deeply governed by perception, not only by reality, but by how reality appears. Insecurity is the internal version of that truth. It is the feeling that identity depends on being received correctly. As years unfold, this dependency evolves. Comparison becomes constant. The mind scans others for signals of superiority or threat. Small interactions begin to feel like judgments, and gradually, the person begins to perform. They speak to be liked. They act to be accepted. They defend to be respected. Confidence becomes something external, a mask worn for survival. Psychologically, insecurity is often a fear of social rejection. The brain treats exclusion as danger, so it urges adaptation, blend in, impress, stay safe. But this adaptation has a cost. It fractures self-trust. The more a person relies on external approval, the less stable they feel alone. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels exposed. This is where Machiavelli's secret becomes relevant, because the path to confidence does not begin by gaining more attention. It begins by loosening the need for it. To understand confidence, one must first understand insecurity, not as failure, but as a learned attachment to being seen. And once that attachment is recognized, the possibility of freedom quietly opens. True confidence is not a mood. It is not something that appears only on good days. Psychologically, confidence is a structure. It is built through regulation, self-trust, and internal stability. Neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly predicting. It anticipates outcomes, interprets social cues, and prepares responses. When a nervous system is unstable, the mind becomes reactive. It seeks reassurance. It overthinks. It fears judgment. But when a nervous system is regulated, something shifts. The person becomes calmer inside. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and control, remains active. Emotion is still present, but it is not driving behavior. This is confidence, the ability to feel without being ruled by feeling. Machiavelli understood that power belongs to those who control themselves first, not those who control others. Confidence works the same way. It is not dominance. It is restraint. Psychology calls this an internal locus of control, a sense that worth is not dependent on constant external response. When a person trusts their own grounding, they do not need to chase validation. They do not rush to prove themselves. They do not collapse under misunderstanding. Confidence becomes quiet. It shows in slow speech, in measured reaction, in the absence of urgency. This is why confident people often appear mysterious. Not because they are hiding something, but because they're not leaking emotion outward. Their stability is internal. True confidence is also built through consistency. The brain learns trust through repetition. When a person keeps showing up for themselves, even in silence, the mind begins to settle. It recognizes reliability. Over time, confidence becomes less about belief and more about familiarity with one's own strength. Not loud strength, grounded strength. And this is Machiavelli's secret. People are drawn to what is unshaken. They respect what cannot be easily moved. Confidence is not performance. It is presence. Even when the mind begins to understand true confidence, resistance appears. Because confidence is not only growth, it is exposure. To become grounded means letting go of familiar defenses. The need to be liked, the habit of explaining, the reflex to prove worth. And the mind hesitates. It asks, what if silence is mistaken for weakness? What if calm is ignored? What if restraint becomes vulnerability? This is the inner conflict. Insecurity is loud because it seeks protection. Confidence is quiet because it accepts uncertainty. But quietness feels risky at first. The ego wants reassurance. It wants immediate proof that it is safe, respected, understood. So it urges reaction. Speak quickly. Defend quickly. Be seen quickly. Machiavelli understood that most people are controlled by this urgency. They reveal themselves through emotional speed. The confident mind must resist that pull. This resistance is uncomfortable because it feels like standing alone without armor. The person must tolerate being misunderstood. They must allow silence to exist without filling it. They must accept that not everyone will approve. Psychologically, this is where confidence becomes real. It is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to hold fear without obeying it. The nervous system learns slowly that discomfort is not danger. That judgment does not equal collapse. That identity survives without constant confirmation. This chapter is where many retreat. They return to performance because it feels safer than stillness. But the transformation happens only through staying present. Confidence is not built by avoiding resistance. It is built by passing through it, by letting the ego soften, by letting urgency dissolve. And in that quiet inner struggle, something deeper begins to take root. A self that no longer depends on being protected by others' perception. There's a turning point where confidence stops being something desired and becomes something embodied. It does not happen through loud victories. It happens through restraint. Machiavelli understood a simple law of power. The one who reacts less often controls the frame. Most people lose presence because they surrender it emotionally. They defend too quickly. They explain too much. They chase respect instead of carrying it. The Machiavellian secret of confidence is this: do not rush to prove yourself. The calmest person in the room often holds the most authority, not because they dominate, but because they are not moved. At this turning point, the mind begins to withdraw from unnecessary battles, not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. The person recognizes that confidence is not built by winning every interaction. It is built by choosing which moments deserve energy. This is where silence becomes strength. When provocation meets no reaction, it weakens. When judgment meets no defense, it loses direction. Confidence becomes a form of psychological control, not control over others, but control over the self. Machiavelli knew that people respect what feels immovable. They fear what cannot be manipulated. So the turning point is internal. A person stops outsourcing their worth to response. They stop seeking permission to exist powerfully. They become steady. Their speech becomes slower. Their reactions become measured. Their presence becomes heavier, even in quietness. Nothing dramatic changes outwardly, but inwardly everything shifts. Confidence becomes less about being admired and more about being anchored. This is Machiavelli's turning point. Power is not loud. It is composed. And once the mind understands this, confidence no longer needs to be chased. It simply begins to appear. After the turning point, confidence begins to settle. It becomes less like a feeling and more like a baseline. Integration is quiet. There is no moment where the world applauds the change. No clear proof that strength has arrived. But internally, something stabilizes. The person no longer reacts with urgency. They no longer depend on constant reassurance. They begin to carry themselves with calm continuity. This is self-possession. Psychologically, it is emotional regulation in practice. The nervous system learns that silence is not danger. That misunderstanding is not collapse. That rejection is not disappearance. Confidence becomes the ability to remain present even when discomfort arises. Boundaries form naturally, not as aggression, but as clarity. The person knows what deserves energy and what is not. They do not overextend to be liked. They do not shrink to avoid judgment. They begin to trust their own center. This is where confidence matures. It becomes compassionate rather than performative. It does not need to dominate. It does not need to impress. It simply exists. Machiavelli understood that lasting power is stable, not reactive. So is confidence. The integrated person speaks less, but with weight, moves slowly, but with intention, listens more than they explain. Their presence becomes unforced. This is not arrogance. It is groundedness, a quiet agreement within the self. Worth is not something negotiated daily through attention. It is something held. Over time, confidence becomes embodied, not as perfection, but as steadiness. Fear may still appear. Uncertainty may still exist, but they no longer control behavior. The person remains, and that remaining is the deepest form of confidence, to belong to oneself fully, without needing the world to confirm it. In the end, confidence is not something loud. It is not the absence of fear. It is not constant certainty. It is not a performance of strength. It is quiet alignment. A person who becomes truly confident does not need to announce it. They do not rush to correct perception. They do not beg to be understood. They simply remain steady. Machiavelli understood that the strongest presence is often the least reactive, not because it is cold, but because it is disciplined. Confidence, at its deepest level, is self-trust. The trust that identity does not shatter in silence. That worth does not depend on applause. That misunderstanding does not erase truth. The confident person moves differently. They listen longer. They choose carefully. They speak only when necessary. Their calm becomes a kind of language. It tells others, this mind cannot be easily shaken. This presence does not require permission, and that is why it feels powerful. not because it intimidates, but because it is grounded. Confidence is not domination. It is freedom from the need to be dominated by perception. It is the ability to exist without performing, to walk through the world without urgency, to know that respect is not chased. It is carried. This is Machiavelli's secret. Not cruelty, not manipulation, but composure. A person who owns themselves fully becomes difficult to provoke, difficult to control, difficult to diminish. And in that quiet steadiness, confidence becomes simple, not dramatic, not loud, just real. A calm center untouched by noise. That is where the journey ends. Not with victory over others, but with possession of the self.